So here's the thing, you're all going to die. And I've come within a hair's breadth of dying quite a few times, so I'm a bit of an expert. But first I was born and diagnosed at 9 weeks of age with cystic fibrosis. I struggled until I was 21 years old and I just managed to bypass death. Being released from its grip and returning to life is like being thrown from a moving train. It's one hell of a jolt to go from such a place of peace and acceptance and expecting to die only to wake up. I've fought all my life and I've lost nearly 70 of my friends to the very disease that I have. So cystic fibrosis isn't hard to die from. Your lungs get infection after infection. They fill with mucus, and then one quiet night, a much worse infection slips in, and soon after, you drown. I've always been well versed in the language of death, and while that may not be ideal, it's my reality. And so it still surprises me that all I felt when I was dying all those years ago was this kind of detached numbness. 16 years ago, with just days to live, and having started saying my goodbyes, just after midnight on the 22nd of August, 1998, I got the call that there were donor lungs available for me. I went on the transplant list on New Year's Day 1998, the day after my 21st birthday, and it didn't take long for my body to start shutting down. So I squared up and readied myself to die. But instead, I managed to bitch slap death and live. So this is my chest a few days post-transplant. A perfect incision and a free breast lift thanks to Medicare. Now there's a few words that I use very sparingly, and suffer is one, but I really suffered after my transplant. In fact, the day my epidural was removed, it was as though someone had poured lighter fuel all over my chest and set it alight. And hallucinating from the pain, I remember seeing these flames leap out of my chest, and no matter how much morphine was pumped into me, we just couldn't get the pain under control. So because my body was used to breathing with these, that's a lung, that's not how a lung should supposed to look, I ended up with acute rejection in the first 10 days following transplant, which nearly killed me. And after massive doses of corticosteroids, aka not anabolic, I'm going to have a banging hot body, I emerged looking like Bert Newton with blonde hair. And later, a Caucasian Asian. Now, some people think that transplant is a cure for cystic fibrosis, but it's not. CF is an often fatal condition, and while it would have been ideal to have my transplant and have a map where I finish my degree, do postgrad, learn a language, fall in love, go overseas, my journey has been so off-road, it's almost quite hilarious. My recovery took at least 18 months, and because my broken sternum and fractured ribs stubbornly refused to heal, I became addicted to narcotics. One day, my doctors called me on my addiction and said they would bring me into hospital for a 2-week slow and measured detox. I said, great. Then I went home and poured all of my morphine down the sink and did a 3-day rapid detox. Now, when you detox from something as addictive and powerful as morphine, you feel like you've had the living daylights beaten out of you. You shake uncontrollably, you sweat bullets, and your bodily functions do things you never thought possible. You also try and literally crawl out of your skin. After I'd done it, it actually was as though I had shed a skin, but I soon realised that detoxing was the easy part. It's the spiritual pain that stays with you, and it's near impossible to detox from that. I had a couple of friends die when I was waiting for a transplant, and one was a 16-year-old boy called Jamie. He summoned me to his room one day, and he said, "The doctors have told me I'm dying. I'm going to die. I'm 16. And all I could say was, "I know, mate." It wasn't good enough, and I wanted to be able to give a better answer than, "I know, mate," but I just couldn't. When you're on the transplant list and your friends are dying, it can be quite a disincentive to live, and with that comes great guilt. Survivor's guilt from all my friends who have died before, all who are dying now, and later on from my donor and her family. The only thing that has helped me go from guilt to gratitude is a Vipassana I did last year, which is a 10-day silent meditation retreat my ass. It was hard work. But it did set me free from the trauma and pain of my life. It was like a rebirth. I eventually went back to uni after my transplant, where I'd been studying my lifelong passion of singing and acting, because being on stage was the only place I felt truly liberated and unaffected by my disease, even if it meant having a lung bleed just before I went out to tread the boards. But in an ironic twist of fate, my left vocal cord was paralysed during transplant surgery. I remember coming off life support and my first words being really squeaky, kind of like a chipmunk. But my voice stayed squeaky, and by the time I had sorted out the relatively simple things like how to breathe, cough, eat, and walk again, I didn't need an ENT specialist to tell me that my once mighty voice was shot. I was left feeling a little indifferent to my new life because I had been holding on. I had been living to be on the stage and to use these beautiful new lungs and to fill them with air and to sing. But I was alive, and that was a pretty good trade-off. And I wanted to finish my degree, so I thought to what I did best after singing and acting, and that was writing. One of my favourite modern writers, Elizabeth Gilbert, once wrote that writing is like a holy calling, and my heart did a little explosion when I heard that, because it is so much like spiritual care. Writing helps me make sense of the world, but it's far more than just words. One of my favourite things to do is to send these little vignettes out into cyberspace and to let them breathe for a while. And when someone connects to the magic of that, to the spirit of it, that's my version of magic. I'm very lucky to have struck a balance between writing, great health, and spiritual care. And now more than ever, I'm leaning towards the notion that one can't exist without the other, but more on that later. In 2006, when I was teaching creative writing and trying to finish my master's, I received a phone call about an abnormal pap smear. Just stay with me. This was indicative of some cancerous changes in my lady bits. So now I'm going to be totally anatomically precise and say that it's my vulva. I ended up with vulval cancer. The cancer was caused by the anti-rejection drugs I take for transplant. What a gift. My gynecological oncologist, can you believe there's a dedicated box doctor? We decided to try some non-invasive therapy first, which ended up being incredibly invasive because I had to apply a topical chemotherapy ointment, which burns off the skin. So after about 8 courses of that, you can imagine what it did to my vulva. There it is again, vulva. It was a pretty woeful time, and I got addicted to narcotics again. By November 2007, it was clear that I needed extensive surgery. But first, I had a pre-designer vagina party. You should see the gifts people bought. So I had a surgery that's called a radical vulvectomy. Nothing rad about it, so I will sum it up by saying that I was peeled like a grape from my clitoris to my rectum. I like to say clit to crack, just rolls off the tongue a little easier. And terrifyingly, before I was wheeled into theatre, my surgeon said, "Carly, I think we're going to have to remove your clitoris." So I said, "Okay, just leave me to die on the table. That will be fine." Clearly that didn't happen because I'm still here. Yay. And donor skin for the skin grafts were taken from my inner left thigh. And to top it all off, I had to have my bowel redirected in the form of an ileostomy, or a poo bag. Yeah. For the first few days, I was faring pretty well, but then I ended up with a serious bowel obstruction, which you can see right there, and I just never recovered. Now, I had dozens of people looking at my lady bits, but the worst and possibly most hilarious part was that it was Movember. So it was like having 70s porn stars inspecting progress day in, day out. I'm pretty sure half the hospital saw my vagina, and I know it's in a medical journal somewhere. On about day 5, my dad arrived to see a group of nurses gathered outside my room. He walked in and found me slumped in a chair and unresponsive, drooling like I had end-stage dementia. The nurses said they were looking for answers and that I would be fine. But Dad knew that something wasn't right. So, in the true spirit of TEDx, here's an idea worth sharing. Question. Always question. Stuff the consequences, because demanding answers has saved my life more than once. The next day I started throwing massive seizures, and so I was rushed to intensive care where I was stabilised and had all sorts of scans done on my brain. My parents were told not to come up because there was nothing they could do, but Dad, being Dad, came up only to find me in a coma. He started demanding answers. Would I stay in the coma? Would I be brain damaged? The doctors could not give him any definitive answers. Well, this wasn't good enough for my old man, and what he did next saved my life. He called my transplant physician, Peter Hopkins, who rushed to the hospital to try and work out what had gone so horrendously wrong. He established that I was having the seizures because I had been being starved. I haven't been being fed. So all of my electrolytes, the ones that keep all of you guys kicking, salt, magnesium, potassium, was so depleted that I was close to having a heart attack. Also, a very astute ICU doctor wasn't happy with my brain scans, and so I was sent for more. And finally, a break. There was no brain damage, although that's debatable on who you speak with. Now, because I was on a cocktail of drugs that would have made Courtney Love circa 20 years incredibly envious, Peter worked out that I was being overdosed. So I was ripped off every single pain drug, which sent me into acute narcotic withdrawal. I would thrash around the bed until my knees turned black. In that photo, they're just starting to, well, actually they've faded a fair bit by then. And if my skin would get so hot, it felt like it was melting off, and then I'd be freezing cold. And for years later, it was as though my thermostat was broken, and apparently that can happen when you throw seizures and go into a coma. But even more telling were the dreams or terrors I had while I was in the coma. I went to other worlds, and they are still so real to me that I can almost reach out and touch them. And so I woke up again. Life had clung to me and me to it. I learned how to walk, eat, and I guess the hardest thing was learning to change my ileostomy, to change my poo bag, and I'm not going to subject you to any photos of that. Now, I tell you, this thing had a life of its own. It would leak. It would explode clean off my body, especially when I was out, and not nearly a night went past when I would wake up absolutely, literally shit-faced, where the momentum of the explosion would hit the fan above my bed. Now, I always maintain that things can be worse, but this one time I thought, no. No, they can't. I have a broken vagina and an exploding stoma. But I soon thought of some alternatives, ripped myself back to reality, and yeah, things can always be worse. In fact, I'm just bloody lucky to be here. After 3 months, my ileostomy was successfully reversed, major blessing, and despite the surgery on my lady bits, vulva, there's that word again, I'm happy to report that when I got home, I had one of a hell of a hallelujah moment because everything still worked just fine. I'm also happy to report that 7 years later, I'm still in remission, although cancer is never far from my mind, with my last scare being about 6 weeks ago. Okay, so what does all this mean? After I emerged from my coma, my life was unrecognisable. It was as if tectonic plates had shifted deep in my soul, and I had never been so afraid of dying. I was anchored to fear and complete disconnection from everything and everyone around me. So I had no choice but to become a professional model and a professional sniper for friends who were in need of organs. Two years after my surgery, I had been commissioned to write a book, so I was writing full time, but the idea of palliative care, or caring for the dying, kept surfacing. I'd always had an interest in palliative care, and I was having real trouble resolving my last near-death experience. One of my friends had recently done a course at Karuna House, which is a hospice here in Brisbane, called Spiritual Care with the Dying. I walked into that course as a woman so afraid of death, but I emerged a free woman with a real absence of fear. And I'd not only found my passion, but I'd found my purpose, and that was thrilling. Living with a terminal disease, my life has always been punctuated by death, and growing up, I had an almost abnormal grasp of it. From when I was a little girl, I'd been helping nurse my dying friends, which isn't normal for a child, but it was normal for me. The way children died of cystic fibrosis in the 1980s was quite barbaric, with not enough pain relief and certainly no privacy. Just a curtain drawn around a bed in a 6-bed cubicle as your child took their last breaths. So having an interest in death and dying has led me to my ultimate passion and vocation as a spiritual carer, or as I like to call it, a death midwife. And this for me is just a natural progression of my natural skill set. I want to help people reclaim their death and give power back to people and their families by bringing dying and after-death care back into the home, from the hospital back into the home, just like we used to do it. Now, one unique advantage, obviously, is that I've been there. I've been to the edge. I've stood on that precipice, looking into the dark belly of my own death. So for me, this is a gift. I have been gifted the passage of dying. The idea of service inspires and excites me. I've been helped by people all my life, so it's my turn to help people in need. My professional metanoia, which is like a sacred promise to self, is that no one should die alone. So how good would it be to have multi-faith and agnostic spiritual carers in hospitals in a pastoral care setting, or even better, more hospices and more home hospice care, because in Australia we are so lagging behind with the rest of the world with hospice care. So many people die alone, and it's something I feel really uncomfortable about. The closer you get to death, the more you understand life, and through great suffering comes great clarity. So when someone dies alone, it is us who lose out. The living lose by not engaging with people who have so much to share when they're between worlds. To be with a dying person and listen to their deep conversations with long-departed friends and loved ones is really quite mind-blowing. And it happened very recently with my friend Sean, who died in August. He had this transition of consciousness as I sat with him, and he became truly ready. I, however, was not. To be able to give the power back to people when they're feeling hopeless, or even worse, meaningless, is something that motivates me no end. Because even in their time of physical and existential suffering, people who have months, days, or even hours to live have the most to give in their freedom an ability to surrender with peace and love and connection and a massive lack of ego and bullshit. So death and dying, while it may be a common curiosity, it's a strange passion, but so are dominoes and squash. I've chosen to serve, and I want to do that with reverence, compassion, and an open heart. But what about spirituality? It's such an all-encompassing concept, and people who aren't dying even have trouble with it. I have to say that I've struggled with it, and considering that it's my vocation and I'm writing a book about it, I should really know where I stand. Or should I? I don't actually know if I want all the answers. There's no doubt we live in a death-denying culture, and Western society is so resistant to the inevitability of death. And this is why we need to get familiar with our own mortality. We need to talk about to our families about what we want before there's a crisis. We need to speak to our children because it's a routine of life's progression. We prepare like maniacs for birth. We read, we Lamaze, we breathe, we have birthing plans. And with babies, they need help from other humans when they're born. And so do we when we die, but rarely do we prepare for our own death. To become more mindful and accepting of the beautiful simplicity that is impermanence is to arrive at peace. To be comfortable with uncertainty and whatever that may bring, that's being human. So heal your relationships, forgive, love wildly, connect, whether it's with people, nature, art, and do something unnerving every now and again that makes you feel a little bit alive, because you only get to do life and death once, unless you're me. Death is inevitable, but living is optional. And while it may just be an option, it's the best damn one we've got. So live and give. Thank you.